Hi, I'm Millie and I make things using skills and materials I may or may not have experience with. Today, I want to talk about how I upgraded my pet toad's enclosure and all that went into that project. This is Jinro, my Moroccan green toad. I adopted him in April of last year, and up until now, he has lived in a 6-gallon Reptile terrarium. I have always intended on upgrading him, but then we ended up moving out of our old place, and that really took away time from me being able to get to this project. But nonetheless, here we are. So, to start, right before we moved out, I bought this wooden box online that I think is intended for incubating chicks. If you're someone who's able to build simple things with wood, I'm sure you could figure out how to make this yourself, but I really didn't want to teach myself a whole new skill this time around. Truthfully, I was planning on simply putting dirt in this thing and calling it a day, but then after thinking it over, I knew the moisture in this enclosure would eventually damage the wood, and I'd end up having to replace it a second time, which I really wanted to avoid. So I began researching ways to make wooden enclosures reptile safe. I started with this video here from Talking Serpents on YouTube. If you're interested in learning what other options there are, I recommend watching his video. But I ended up going with the Varathane water-based polyurethane. I think that's how you say that. Before I go in with the sealant though, I need to drill holes where the lights would sit since this box didn't support lighting prior. And already, without me even knowing it, I had screwed this project up on this very first step. I measured the circumference of the lamp and I cut out two 1 3/4 inch holes on the top. You'll see later how that bites me in the ass. But once the holes were done, I went in with the polyurethane. I lost count of how many coats I did of this stuff. I want to say like 3 or 4 all over, and I made sure to really get in all the cracks and grooves to ensure everything was sealed. For the lid, I tried my best to cover and protect the plexiglass, but this ends up not working, and the paper actually fused to the wood, which required me to have to cut it off, which resulted in me scratching up the plexiglass, and I ended up having to replace the whole thing in the end. So yeah, take that information as you will, and hopefully learn from my mistake. Anyways, now for the main event, this custom rock feature. So I followed the Reptile Way tutorial for this, basically verbatim. If you want a better explanation on how to make this, I would go watch their video, but I think they actually might have a couple videos on their channel about this. So for this project, they use really thick insulation foam, but for the life of me, I could not find anything thicker than 1 inch at the hardware stores. I then looked online, but everything seemed so expensive, or it was way more board than I needed. Sorry to say, but if you live in the US, I personally can't recommend a good place to get foam board because I lucked out. My grandpa ended up having a ton of 2-inch thick foam board from a leftover plane that he was assembling, and I guess he gave up on it years ago. Alright, so now that I had the board, all I did was measure out how big the inside of the enclosure was and cut out a platform that size. I'm using a cheap hot wire cutter I got on Amazon, and this thing was so satisfying to use. It ran through that foam so smoothly, and the sound was also really satisfying. This stuff is really nasty though. I highly recommend doing this all outside and with a mask. Of course, I never listened to that advice, but I did have a big fan blowing all the fumes away from me as I worked. Once I had the base, I began sketching out how I wanted the shape of the rock to look. I pretty much stacked the boards one on top of the other and cut into both layers at once so you wouldn't see any seams. I really wanted a cave and a basking ledge built into it, plus I thought it would be cool to have his water source be built into the rock as well. I had a big brain moment when I realized I could just cut a hole in one of the foam layers and then have the top of the layer underneath of it be the floor of the water hole. Once I was happy with the shape of things, I hot glued all the layers together while it was still inside the box. That way I could ensure it would fit snugly along the walls. Then I went back through the whole thing and really tried to hide those seams. You can see here I also cut out a second cave since I know he'd really appreciate a spot he could dig into. I also wanted to create some texture, obviously since rocks aren't smooth, but also so that in our next step, the mixture would stick well to the surface. I went crazy on this thing, stabbing it all over, chipping away at the surface at all angles so that it all felt as natural as possible. I did get a little too reckless though, and I did burn myself, so be careful. I know it looks so ugly and terrible in this stage, but trust me, it will all smooth out. Before moving on, I run my heat gun all over it so that any thin strands get melted down and smoothed out. This is also where I tested it out and set up the enclosure with all the decor to make sure I was happy with the final shape. Alrighty, so the next step is to go in with grout. I'm using a 10-pound bag of Polyblend non-sanded grout in the color Pewter. Again, I'm following the Reptile Way tutorial here and coating the entire thing with a thick layer of this grout mixture, making sure to mash my brush into all the cracks and crevices. I wait for the top to dry some and then I coat the bottom of the foam as well. I did 3 coats of this grout and used a little bit of iron oxide powder to make the grout darker in between layers. This is how the Reptile Way suggests doing it so that you can really tell which layer you're working on. Something that the Reptile Way didn't mention is how long this stuff takes to dry in between layers. Just so you can all prepare better, I wanted to share that it took about 2 to 3 days for each layer to dry completely. You can tell when it's not fully dry because it will change color, getting lighter as it hardens. So when I saw dark spots on it the next day, I had to leave it out to dry longer and it just sucked having to wait. While I was adding on my layers, I'd go back over the whole thing with my brush to get rid of any brush stroke marks. I kind of just blotted on the surface to break up the streaks, and it created a really convincing rock texture. I was actually really happy with this. After the final grout layer, it was time to add some dimension to the rock. Initially, I tried using more grout to do this, but I really didn't like the end result, so I did switch to acrylic paints. But before I did that, I made sure to clean up the holes where my bamboo is going to go. These will get plugged up later, so I'm not really worried about them being sealed entirely. Just like in the Reptile Way tutorial, I started by giving the whole thing a wash of acrylic paint and water. I blot away any pooling of paint and then let that dry. Then I gathered white, gray, brown, blue, and green paint to start adding color value to the rock. This is the best way to make rock look super realistic. A lot of miniature artists actually do it this way, so if you want a better explanation on how you can do it, I would suggest watching videos on how to paint miniature rocks. Essentially, you get a tiny bit of paint and dry brush it on. You shouldn't be putting hardly any pressure onto the surface. You really are just letting the brush naturally glide over the highest ridges and edges of the surface. I start with a dark gray and then I work up to a lighter gray, applying the least amount of that to the peaks of the ridges. Then I take a mossy green and brush that in a few spots on the rock, adding most of it to the water pool. I throw in a little bit of brown just to add variation, and lastly I add some blue to the pool just to manufacture a deep water look for it. Once the paint dried, I decided to coat the entire thing in polyurethane. In the tutorial video, they only seal the water bowl part of the rock, but I thought, why not waterproof the whole thing, right? Well, you can already see how white this stuff goes on, and when it dried, it completely changed the color of everything. So I processed that information and then redid the whole paint job a second time. I did not seal it again though, and instead only added a thin layer of the polyurethane to the water bowl only. And with that, it was basically done. I just needed to add in the bamboo, which I did with super glue because I really didn't want him moving these suckers around. Alright, so we're almost done now. Back to the box. I did plan on making that plexiglass wall removable, but I knew if I was taking it off, then any dirt that was near the edge would just fall out. So I thought I would add a barrier that could hold all the substrate back, but still allow the full wall to slide in and out. I definitely did not execute this idea well though. I didn't know what I was doing, so when I went to cut the plastic sheet, it kept cracking. So I thought maybe if I warm it up first and then cut it, it would work better, but this resulted in the plastic warping slightly. I didn't care enough to try to fix it though, so I used the strip that I had cut and moved on. Of course, I sealed all the seams with aquarium silicone and let that dry for 2 days before moving on. For the inside, I am keeping his old tank's backdrop, and I'm just going to laminate it since I don't want to have to pay for a new one, and I do like this one anyways. But to make it look a little more seamless, I went in with paint so that it would be less obvious that this backdrop does not fit. This paint job isn't perfect, but I really don't care. It's good enough. For the light holes, I ordered this thin mesh so the lights could sit right on top. I just popped these little circles in and they held in place since I cut them a tiny bit bigger than the hole itself. This is when I attached the lid back onto it and added a support hinge since I could tell that this lid would drive me crazy if I kept having to hold it open. I also added a lock-in clasp. Not that I think he's going to be able to open the lid, but if you've ever owned reptiles, you know you can never be too safe. And now here's where I f***ed up. Everything was done now. I was super eager to set it up and see it all come together, and I had literally just finished putting everything inside when I realized the lights didn't fit in the holes that I cut. When I had cut the holes into the wood, I measured them based on the circumference of the lamps, not the bulbs. So you can see them falling over here since they're too big and weren't sitting down inside the hole. I tried to see if it would be okay if they just sat on the wood, but I noticed smoke or steam. I didn't know, but to be safe, I gave up and decided that I'd have to make them bigger. Actually, I almost started a fire too. I don't know if you noticed, but when the light falls down onto the table, it burns a hole into my fabric there. The bulbs that came with the lamps were way too high of a wattage anyways, so I did switch them in the end. So yeah, I had to pivot, which hardly ever goes well for me, and it definitely didn't go well here because I did order a bigger drill bit, and I did try and cut a bigger hole. But I don't work with wood often, so I didn't understand why I was having such a hard time getting the drill to cooperate, and that resulted in this mess. I realize now that the spike in the middle had nothing to grip onto, so there was no way for it to stabilize itself. And so I came crashing through the roof, destroying the whole top panel. I didn't record this because I genuinely thought it was going to be a quick and easy fix, but I really wish I had now because I was crashing out over this. It was fine though. After contemplating throwing the whole thing out, I realized all I had to do was replace that top panel. Nothing else was damaged, thankfully. So I had to somehow pry the roof off, which took some time, and then clean up the residual mess and make a whole new roof. This included me making new mesh covers and sealing the whole thing 3 times before screwing it back on, sealing it again, and then adding the silicone back. Then, after all of that, it was finally done. I'm so glad it's over. I'm so glad General has a more enriching environment now, and I can tell he's already enjoying it so much more than his old tank. Anyways, thanks for watching me fumble through this project. I have more DIY videos in the working, so if you're interested, maybe subscribe.